Hey guys, John here. Today we're in Avenger 2, and today we're going to be talking about snare synthesis, which is a lot of fun, but also there's a lot of little things that we have to keep in mind if we want to make a pretty decent snare. So we're going to be making something kind of like this here, which also does react to velocity, so if we hit it kind of softly, and then harder, it can increase in volume. So anyway, we're going to be making something kind of similar like this. And the reason for Avenger 2 is the routing makes this super simple and gives us a lot more opportunities to make something really cool. So with that being said, let's go to menu, initialize, so we can start on a fresh patch here. So we have our first oscillator, and this first one, I kind of like to envision this as the fundamental, because a snare drum will have the fundamental, so kind of the main tonality of the snare drum, and then we also have another characteristic, which is the rattles, the noise oscillator that we're going to be using, and then we kind of combine those together to create one whole snare drum. So the first oscillator here, so we have a default on a saw. Now, sometimes you can use a sine wave, but I've honestly found better results using a triangle wave, and that's because we have a little bit more harmonics to work with. So we can scroll here to a triangle wave. So we have something kind of like this, which at the moment now it's kind of quiet, but we're going to start bringing stuff up as we go on. So for this, as we hit different notes, it's going to be tracking our pitch, and we don't necessarily want that. So here on the keyboard tracking, we can double click this and hit this to 0. Now, it's the same pitch every note that we hit, which is exactly that we want. Unless, I mean, of course, you want your pitches to increase it to the snare drum, whatever you want to do. But generally, I like to keep the pitch tracking off for doing this here. So now we have a triangle wave. Our pitch tracking is off. Now, the next thing we need to decide is, what frequency range is this fundamental going to be at? So by default here, this transposes 0, obviously, and you can always change this later on, but I do like maybe putting this on maybe 3 or 4, somewhere around here. That feels like kind of a good range. So we have kind of a tone like this. So we have this first oscillator, and let's double click this and let's put in fund for fundamental. Just I don't really want to write that long of a word. So this first one here is going to our first amp. So what we can do is bring down the sustain, because it's not going to sustain every time we hit this note. And maybe something like that for now. So what we can do for now, let's put an equalizer on here. Let's put a compressor on here. And for now, let's kind of bring this up so we can kind of focus in on this a little more. So we have something kind of like that. Okay. And always later on, we're going to be kind of tweaking the envelopes of the amp and the filter and stuff like that to really kind of hone things in. With snare drums, it's interesting because you can make 100 different snare drums from a fresh patch, and they're all going to sound slightly different because there's so many little things that influence the sound here. So we have our main sound here. Now what we need to do for this patch is go plus on the FX2 and then plus again, so we have 3 stacks. So this first one, the concept is that we're going to be processing the fundamental only through this first effects here. The second effects is going to be for the rattles or the noise and all the other kind of stuff, and then both of these are going to output to effects stack 3, so we can process both of them together, which is the reason I do like using Avenger for this. So FX1, instead of going to master effects, we're going to go to FX3, and for the FX2 stack, we're going to do the same thing, FX3. So both of these are going to be ending up in here, and then from there it goes to the master effects. Okay, so we have our triangle wave. Pretty cool here. So the next thing that we need to add is going to be the noise or the rattles. So for that, we can hit plus on our oscillator, and we can just put, I guess, noise for this right here. Now, let's mute this guy. So we're going to have our saw wave. So what we can do is bring down the gain here, so we have nothing. And then we start bringing up our noise. Now what's cool is that here we have the volume, but also if we right click, we have different types of noise that we can kind of scroll through. Now this is going to be very important because the tonality of the noise here is going to really make a difference. And also keep in mind we have this noise up here, so we can do noise mono, stereo 50%, or stereo 100%. It really depends on what you want to do. We can always change it throughout, but for now we can leave this on 50%, and maybe if we feel like it, we can check out the other ones once our snare is pretty much built. Okay, so we have this noise. Now this guy is also going to the first amp, which I kind of like doing these a little bit individually. So we're going to hit a new amp here, and just for my brain's sake, let's go to a new filter, even though we're not necessarily going to be using too much on this first filter. But I do like keeping oscillator 2 on filter 2, just makes it a little bit more sense in my brain. So for here, what we need to do as well is send this one also to the second effect stack, right? So for here, we're going to go to filter 2, start doing our routing, and then our amp 1 goes to amp 2, and then our out effects 1 goes to out effects 2. Okay, so now we have our basic routing, our fundamentals, kind of in the works here, and then we have our noise, so it's kind of already created. Now, one thing important as well on the fundamental is a little bit of pitch modulation, which is really nice. We go to our pitch tab, and what we can start doing is kind of getting that little pitch modulation there, because that's also very important once you hit or once you get a stick and whack a drum. It's going to have a little bit of that simulation there. Now, depending on the style of the snare that you're making, you can increase this exponentially, make it kind of crazy, or you can kind of dial it down for a little bit more of a realistic sound. And that's one of the things I'm saying. There's so many different things that we can think about and tweak to make a snare drum, which is why you can make 100 of them, and they're all going to sound different. Okay, so that sounds kind of cool for now. And maybe give this a little bit of release here for the first amp here. Just so it sounds a little bit smoother. Okay, so we have this for the most part done. We're going to be coming back to things back and forth and so on and so forth. But let's mute this for now and let's focus on the noise. So we don't want this to sustain, right? So this is obviously going to amp 2. And amp 2 has full sustain, so let's bring this down. And we want kind of a snappy kind of a noise burst. And again, depending on how snappy or kind of extended this noise is going to change the style of that snare drum. So we can have something like this for now to work with. Now FX2, what we can do is also bring in an EQ if we need to adjust anything. Also a compressor. And maybe a little bit of release here. Something kind of like that. Okay. So now it's kind of a point where we say, okay, let's bring in our fundamental as well. And we notice off the bat, okay, our fundamental's probably a little loud or our noise is too quiet. So what we can do first is kind of bring down our fundamental. And for me, maybe that's a little bit too long of a decay for the fundamental. So let's go back to our amp and let's kind of tweak this decay a little bit. Okay, that's starting to sound a little bit better here. So now we can go back to our noise, maybe adjust the level a little bit. Okay, so for this guy, we can always adjust the type of noise. So that's kind of cool right there. And in addition to making this noise, there's a couple other ways we can kind of mold the sound of this noise. As one is through EQ and the other is going to be through a filter. So remember, this noise is going to filter 2 right over here. So what we can do is click on our type of filter. And for this, we're going to go to a band pass. And then let's try this first one here, this 12. Give it some modulation there. And we can always use some drive on the filter too. Kind of makes things a little interesting. So now we're losing a little bit level on the noise, so then we can always bring it up here in the compressor if we'd like to. And again, let's bring down our fundamental a little bit. Okay, so we have something kind of cool here. And again, there's going to be so many little screws that we kind of have to tweak and mold and kind of change this thing with. So for the most part, on the first effects, we have our EQ just in case we want to do some changing on the fundamental triangle wave, or we can do some stuff with the compressor. And then on FX2, kind of the same deal. And then now we go to FX3. So what is the idea of this guy? So again, we can put an EQ. Now the idea of putting EQs on each rack is for the first one to adjust just the fundamental, then just the noise, and then kind of process these together. Because yes, they are different oscillators, but it's supposed to be one entire sound. And that's why the processing of the third rack is really helpful for this. So we can open this up here. And we can see around here, this is maybe 170 for the fundamental. And if that's too low for you, you can always bring this up a little bit more to 5 maybe. Or bring it down. Kind of really depends on what you want to do. That's why I kind of said I've done this a few times. And I feel like pitching up the snare either 3 or 4 is probably a pretty cool zone. Because you get also that kind of low end meat, I suppose. You can bring that in here a little bit. And then also get another band here. And I open up that Q a little bit. And kind of find that openness of it. Okay, so now we can maybe use a little bit more fundamental and maybe even darken up the noise a little bit as well. Okay. So you have something kind of like this here. So now what we can do is compress both of these together and squash them, right? So they're so they're really good friends, so to speak. To have something kind of like that here. Okay, and now some of it, what's interesting about snares is during the building process of it, it sounds very fake in the sense that we know it's a fundamental, we know it's a noise together, and it doesn't really sound too much like a snare. We're kind of just making the ingredients, and then the effects a little bit later really kind of helps sell it as well. Okay, so you have something kind of like this, and a couple different processings I like to do for this guy is I do like putting a little bit of a dimension and expander on this, kind of bringing this up like that. And the reason for this is to kind of get it out of the synth, so to speak, and put it in a little bit of a room. And just a tiny bit of this. So here's with it. And without it. It's a very subtle thing, but I feel like it kind of opens this up a little bit. Okay, so we have this here. So now we need to choose a reverb that we want to send this through, because reverb always really helps out snares. So obviously in Avenger, we have a lot of different ones. We have the AA reverb, transverb, V-verb, root-verb, impulse, gated, so on and so forth, the V-verb. It really depends on the type of reverb that you want. But for now, let's check out the AA reverb and see how that sounds for us. Okay, so for this guy, I'm going to bring down the pre-delay, maybe the timing. And then bring up some of the filter here, maybe some kind of like that. And maybe a little bit less reflection, maybe reduce the modulation. Okay, so we have something kind of like that there. So now we kind of sit back, and sometimes it's useful to take a little bit of a break from it. If you're making a snare and you're hearing the same sound over and over, it can almost be a little confusing, and you kind of can go in different ways back and forth, and you never really end up with a cohesive sound. So that's definitely a piece of advice. So for this, the basic things are there. So now we kind of want to maybe adjust the sound of it a little bit more. Maybe we want to change some of the noise, so we can go to the noise here and kind of maybe bring some of the fundamental up a little bit. And maybe for the noise amp, we can maybe increase the decay. Or for the fundamental, we can even make it a little bit lower tune, so maybe go to +2. And as you can see in the EQ, this fundamental is now going to be a little bit lower. And then for the fundamental amp, we can go and adjust more of the decay settings. Okay, so we have something kind of cool here. So also what we can do is we can bring some of this stuff down. So maybe like the reverb, let's bring these down here, something kind of like that. And after the compressor, we can always add some more interesting things. So we can add something maybe like a multi-band distortion to add a little bit more harmonics to the entire sound. That's why it's cool to use this third effects bank. So without this guy and with it. And then for both of our amps, if we do want velocity, if that's something that we're kind of interested in, we can bring this up all the way like that for both of these guys. So that would mean if we place them kind of softly, we can do something kind of like that as well. Now there's also some spike, which is a very interesting feature. So if we want our snare to be a little bit more poppy or thwacky, if that's even a word, we can increase that a little bit there as well. So it's also a cool thing to do as well. So we have the fundamental, and then we have the noise, right, which might be a little bit much. Let's bring that down. And then maybe go to our effects, our equalizer here, and maybe sculpt our sound a little bit more. Okay. So we have this fundamental, we have the noise. Now that's just two parts of the puzzle here. We can add another layer of noise, and maybe instead of having it right here for this type of noise color, we can add another noise oscillator and maybe bring it down a little bit so it's a little bit darker noise and send it through a different filter and process that a little bit differently. And that's going to also add to the sound so the noise isn't the same every single time. Or, for example, what's an interesting thing as well, we can go to random and drop this on maybe the volume of the noise, or we can drop this on the noise color, something like that. And every time we hit a different note, it's going to be slightly a little bit differently. So that's another kind of concept that we can do as well. And that's a cool part about snare drums, is that there's so many different things that we can do to kind of make them stand out. So this right here, what we're looking at, is kind of like a template to start with. So this is kind of going to be the things that you're going to have almost every single time with a snare drum: the fundamental oscillator, the noise oscillator, and then from there, that's when you can really change out the pitch envelope. You can even maybe send this through a shaper, so both of these through the shaper, and kind of see what a little bit of a distortion sounds like on that. And then we can always try the different filters, because those are also going to change the sound quite drastically. That one's actually kind of nice as well. Maybe increase the time here. Okay, so just out of curiosity, let's say we can maybe put something like this through the shaper. So for our fundamental, let's go routing plus, and let's go to the shaper. And again, let's always put these after the filter. I kind of prefer them afterwards, and then plus again, and then the shaper, and then let's go after the filter too. Even there, that can be kind of a cool snare as well. Almost maybe a little bit industrial. Let's bring some of that reverb back down a little bit there. Or now in the shaper, we have all these different types of algorithms. I'm sure somebody could use that. So yeah, there's all this whole list here. I think soft is probably one of my favorites. So that might be something kind of interesting as well. Maybe bring in another one up here at the top. So then again, so we listen to this and I'm kind of noticing maybe that pitch envelope could be a little bit quicker. So we can go here to the pitch envelope and maybe bring this over so it's a little bit tighter. Or maybe bring this down a bit so it's not too drastic. And also for the noise, again, we can try out the noise mono. Noise 100%. Which honestly, the 100% sounds a little bit weird to me because we're having the stereo noise with just kind of one fundamental here. So maybe even the noise mono might be the best. Kind of keep them more in the center. So that might be kind of interesting too. So now we're kind of in a point, like I was saying, that we kind of have a basic thing with our fundamental, our noise. So now we can kind of think, what would we want to have on macro? So maybe the amount of reverb, things like that, maybe the amount of distortion, that might be kind of cool as well. But also you can even send these through an additional filter and kind of brighten them or darken them, or even put the noise color on a macro and kind of make the noise. You can change the tonality or the character of that noise. So if you want a brighter snare or a darker snare, it really is just a twist of a button down here, because there's times where we can make a really cool sounding snare, but once we put that in context into a track, we think, oh, okay, maybe we need to pitch it up a little bit or pitch it down, or maybe we need to brighten it up or darken it. So there's a lot of different kind of variables inside a snare drum that would always change depending on the context that you put that in. Something to kind of think about there. I think I have a Falcon kickback here. And it's always good, like I said, to put things in context, maybe make a drum groove and then replace the snare with the one that you created here as well. That might be a possibility. So to wrap things up here, the main components that you want to add, and keep doing this quite a few times, is the fundamental, some noise, and just kind of really dial in how you want those to sound. And the envelopes are going to be very important as well, especially kind of how they both interact with each other. So for an amp 1, that's going to sound weird, right? So that might be also something you might want to put on a macro as well, the decay for both of these. So there's a little bit more of a snappy one if we kind of bring those decays down. Yeah, something kind of like that might be kind of cool for a track. It's also very snappy as well, because we can always increase the decay here. And that might be kind of cool too, because there are some really cool tracks that, more so for me, that I've heard is in some of the agrotech music, where there's some snares and they kind of really carry on the decay for the noise, which sounds pretty awesome, depending on how you want to do it. And then if you want to get even more creative, you can send this FX3 out to another effects deck, or you can go on the master effect and maybe add some delays or some weird things with the quantum effects. That's also kind of a cool option as well. So yeah, definitely try to make some sounds like this as well. There's so many different possibilities. And once you can get to the point where you can craft a decent snare and start making different variations of that snare, they're going to keep sounding cooler and better. And then you're going to have more ideas, more stuff to put on macros. And then from there, a lot of the other stuff is kind of not very difficult. The snare itself, I would say, is probably one of the most, I wouldn't say complicated, I would say more intricate, because there's so many little variations and things you can do versus like a kick drum, for example, or a tom or something kind of like that. So yeah, hopefully you guys learned something from this here. It's a lot of fun to make snares. Just kind of sit down, make it like 3 or 4 snares a day, and then by like the end of the month, you're going to have a whole group of snares, or make one master patch with a lot of different variations so you can kind of just mold it from there. That's also a cool thing to do as well. So yeah, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something, and yeah, we'll see you in the next one.